Welcome to a Fireside Reading of The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. Reading 52. In that moment, Miss Holcomb recognized her sister, recognized the dead alive. Fortunately for the success of the measures taken subsequently, no one was present at that moment but the nurse. She was a young woman, and she was so startled that she was at first quite incapable of interfering. When she was able to do so, her whole services were required by Miss Holcomb, who had for the moment sunk altogether in the effort to keep her own senses under the shock of the discovery. After waiting a few minutes in the harsh, fresh air and the cool shade, her natural energy and courage helped her a little, and she became sufficiently mistress of herself to feel the necessity of recalling her presence of mind for her unfortunate sister's sake. She obtained permission to speak alone with the patient, on condition that they both remained well within the nurse's view. There was no time for questions. There was only time for Miss Holcomb to impress on the unhappy lady the necessity of controlling herself and to assure her of immediate help and rescue if she did so. The prospect of escaping from the asylum by obedience to her sister's directions was sufficient to quiet Lady Glyde and to make her understand what was required of her. Miss Holcomb next returned to the nurse, placed all the gold she then had in her pocket, 3 sovereigns, in the nurse's hands, and asked when and where she could speak to her alone. The woman was at first surprised and distrustful, but on Miss Holcomb's declaring that she only wanted to put some questions which she was too much agitated to ask at that moment, and that she had no intention of misleading the nurse into any dereliction of duty, the woman took the money and proposed 3 o'clock on the next day as the time for the interview. She might then slip out for half an hour after the patients had dined, and she would meet the lady in a retired place outside the high north wall which screened the grounds of the house. Miss Holcomb had only time to assent and to whisper to her sister that she should hear from her on the next day, when the proprietor of the asylum joined them. He noticed his visitor's agitation, which Miss Holcomb accounted for by saying that her interview with Anne Catherick had a little startled her at first. She took her leave as soon after as possible, that is to say, as soon as she could summon courage to force herself from the presence of her unfortunate sister. A very little reflection, when the capacity to reflect returned, convinced her that any attempt to identify Lady Glyde and to rescue her by legal means would, even if successful, involve a delay that might be fatal to her sister's intellects, which were shaken already by the horror of the situation to which she had been consigned. By the time Miss Holcomb had got back to London, she had determined to effect Lady Glyde's escape privately, by means of the nurse. She went at once to her stockbroker and sold out of the funds all the little property she possessed, amounting to rather less than £700. Determined, if necessary, to pay the price of her sister's liberty with every farthing she had in the world, she repaired the next day, having the whole sum about her in bank-notes, to her appointment outside the asylum wall. The nurse was there. Miss Holcomb approached the subject cautiously by many preliminary questions. She discovered, among other particulars, that the nurse had in former times attended on the true Anne Catherick, had been held responsible, although she was not to blame for it, for the patient's escape, and had lost her place in consequence. The same penalty, it was added, would attach to the person then speaking to her if the supposed Anne Catherick was missing a second time, and moreover the nurse in this case had an especial interest in keeping her place. She was engaged to be married, and she and her future husband were waiting till they could save together between £200 and £300 to start in business. The nurse's wages were good, and she might succeed by strict economy in contributing her small share towards the sum required in 2 years' time. On this hint, Miss Holcombe spoke. She declared that the supposed Anne Catherick was nearly related to her, that she had been placed in the asylum under a fatal mistake, and that the nurse would be doing a good and Christian action in being the means of restoring them to one another. Before there was time to start a single objection, Miss Holcombe took 4 bank notes of £100 each from her pocket-book and offered them to the woman as a compensation for the risk she was to run and for the loss of her place. The nurse hesitated through sheer incredulity and surprise. Miss Holcombe pressed the point on her firmly. "You will be doing a good action," she repeated. "You will be helping the most injured and unhappy woman alive. There is your portion. There is your marriage portion for a reward. Bring her safely to me, and I will put those 4 bank notes into your hand before I claim her." "Will you give me a letter saying those words, which I can show to my sweetheart when he asks how I got the money?" inquired the woman. "I will bring the letter with me ready signed and written," answered Miss Holcombe. "Then I'll risk it," said the nurse. "When?" "Tomorrow." It was hastily agreed between them that Miss Holcombe should return early the next morning and wait out of sight among the trees, always, however, keeping near the quiet spot of ground under the north wall. The nurse could fix no time for her appearance, caution requiring that she should wait and be guided by circumstances. On that understanding they separated. Miss Holcombe was at her place with the promised letter and the promised banknotes before 10 the next morning. She waited more than an hour and a half. At the end of that time the nurse came quickly round the corner of the wall, holding Lady Glyde by the arm. The moment they met, Miss Holcombe put the banknotes and the letter into her hand, and the sisters were reunited again. The nurse had dressed Lady Glyde with excellent forethought in a bonnet, veil, and shawl of her own. Miss Holcombe only detained her to suggest a means of turning the pursuit in a false direction when the escape was discovered at the asylum. She was to go back to the house to mention in the hearing of the other nurses that Anne Catherick had been inquiring latterly about the distance from London to Hampshire, to wait till the last moment before discovery was inevitable, and then to give the alarm that Anne was missing. The supposed inquiries about Hampshire, when communicated to the owner of the asylum, would lead him to imagine that his patient had returned to Blackwater Park under the influence of the delusion which made her persist in asserting herself to be Lady Glyde, and the first pursuit would in all probability be turned in that direction. The nurse consented to follow these suggestions, the more readily as they offered her the means of securing herself against any worse consequences than the loss of her place, by remaining in the asylum and so maintaining the appearance of innocence at least. She at once returned to the house, and Miss Holcombe lost no time in taking her sister back with her to London. They caught the afternoon train to Carlisle that same afternoon and arrived at Limmeridge without accident or difficulty of any kind that night. During the latter part of their journey, they were alone in the carriage, and Miss Holcombe was able to collect such remembrances of the past as her sister's confused and weakened memory was able to recall. The terrible story of the conspiracy, so obtained, was presented in fragments, sadly incoherent in themselves and widely detached from each other. Imperfect as the revelation was, it must nevertheless be recorded here before this explanatory narrative closes with the events of the next day at Limmeridge House. Lady Glyde's recollection of the events which followed her departure from Blackwater Park began with her arrival at the London terminus of the South Western Railway. She had omitted to make a memorandum beforehand of the day on which she took the journey. All hope of fixing that important date by any evidence of hers or of Mrs. Mitchelson's must be given up for lost. On the arrival of the train at the platform, Lady Glyde found Count Fosco waiting for her. He was at the carriage door as soon as the porter could open it. The train was unusually crowded, and there was great confusion in getting the luggage. Some person whom Count Fosco brought with him procured the luggage which belonged to Lady Glyde. It was marked with her name. She drove away alone with the Count in a vehicle which she did not particularly notice at the time. Her first question on leaving the terminus referred to Miss Holcombe. The Count informed her that Miss Holcombe had not yet gone to Cumberland. After consideration having caused him to doubt the prudence of her journey, so long a journey without some days' previous rest. Lady Glyde next inquired whether her sister was then staying in the Count's house. Her recollection of the answer was confused, her only distinct impression in relation to it being that the Count declared he was then taking her to see Miss Holcombe. Lady Glyde's experience of London was so limited that she could not tell at the time through what streets they were driving. But they never left the streets, and they never passed any gardens or trees. When the carriage stopped, it stopped in a small street behind a square in which there were shops and public buildings, and many people. From these recollections, of which Lady Glyde was certain, it seems quite clear that Count Fosco did not take her to his own residence in the suburb of St. John's Wood. They entered the house and went upstairs to a back room, either on the first or second floor. The luggage was carefully brought in. A female servant opened the door, and a man with a dark beard, apparently a foreigner, met them in the hall and with great politeness showed them the way upstairs. In answer to Lady Glyde's inquiries, the Count assured her that Miss Holcombe was in the house and that she should immediately be informed of her sister's arrival. He and the foreigner then went away and left her by herself in the room. It was poorly furnished as a sitting room, and it looked out on the backs of houses. The place was remarkably quiet. No footsteps went up or down the stairs. She only heard in the room beneath her a dull, rumbling sound of men's voices talking. Before she had been long left alone, the Count returned to explain that Miss Holcombe was then taking rest and could not be disturbed for a little while. He was accompanied into the room by a gentleman, an Englishman, whom he begged to present as a friend of his. After this singular introduction, in the course of which no names, to the best of Lady Glyde's recollection, had been mentioned, she was left alone with the stranger. He was perfectly civil, but he startled and confused her by some odd questions about herself, and by looking at her while he asked them in a strange manner. After remaining a short time, he went out, and a minute or two afterwards, a second stranger, also an Englishman, came in. This person introduced himself as another friend of Count Fosco's, and he, in his turn, looked at her very oddly and asked some curious questions, never, as well as she could remember, addressing her by name, and going out again after a little while like the first man. By this time she was so frightened about herself, and so uneasy about her sister, that she had thoughts of venturing downstairs again and claiming the protection and assistance of the only woman she had seen in the house, the servant who answered the door. Just as she had risen from her chair, the Count came back into the room. The moment he appeared, he asked anxiously how long the meeting between her sister and herself was. The moment he appeared, she asked anxiously how long the meeting between her sister and herself was to be still delayed. At first he returned an evasive answer, but on being pressed, he acknowledged with great apparent reluctance that Miss Holcombe was by no means so well as he had hitherto represented her to be. His tone and manner in making this reply so alarmed Lady Glyde, or rather so painfully increased the uneasiness which she had felt in the company of the two strangers, that a sudden faintness overcame her, and she was obliged to ask for a glass of water. The Count called from the door for water and for a bottle of smelling salts. Both were brought in by the foreign-looking man with the beard. The water, when Lady Glyde attempted to drink it, had so strange a taste that it increased her faintness, and she hastily took the bottle of salts from Count Fosco and smelt at it. Her head became giddy on the instant. The Count caught the bottle as it dropped out of her hand, and the last impression of which she was conscious was that he held it to her nostrils again. From this point her recollections were found to be confused, fragmentary, and difficult to reconcile with any reasonable probability. Her own impression was that she recovered her senses later in the evening, that she then left the house, that she went, as she had previously arranged to go at Blackwater Park, to Mrs. Vesey's, that she drank tea there, and that she passed the night under Mrs. Vesey's roof. She was totally unable to say how or when or in what company she left the house to which Count Fosco had brought her, but she persisted in asserting that she had been to Mrs. Vesey's, and still more extraordinary that she had been helped to undress and get to bed by Mrs. Rubel. She could not remember what the conversation was at Mrs. Vesey's, or whom she saw there besides that lady, or why Mrs. Rubel should have been present in the house to help her. Her recollection of what happened to her the next morning was still more vague and unreliable. She had some dim idea of driving out, at what hour she couldn't say, with Count Fosco, and with Mrs. Rubel again, for a female attendant. But when and why she left Mrs. Vesey she could not tell. Neither did she know what direction the carriage drove in, or where it set her down, or whether the Count and Mrs. Rubel did or did not remain with her all the time she was out. At this point in her sad story there was a total blank. She had no impressions of the faintest kind to communicate, no idea whether one day or more than one day had passed, until she came to herself, suddenly, in a strange place, surrounded by women who were all unknown to her. This was the asylum. Here she first heard herself called by Anne Catherick's name, and here, as a last remarkable circumstance in the story of the conspiracy, her own eyes informed her that she had Anne Catherick's clothes on. The nurse, on the first night in the asylum, had shown her the marks on each article of her underclothing as it was taken off, and had said, not at all irritably or unkindly, "Look at your own name on your own clothes, and don't worry us all about any more about being Lady Glyde. She's dead and buried, and you're alive and hearty. Do look at your clothes now. There it is, in good marking ink, and there you will find it on all your old things which we've kept in the house. Anne Catherick, as plain as print." And there it was, when Miss Holcombe examined the linen her sister wore on the night of their arrival at Limmeridge House. These were the only recollections, all of them uncertain, and some of them contradictory, which could be extracted from Lady Glyde by careful questioning on the journey to Cumberland. Miss Holcombe abstained from pressing her with any inquiries relating to events in the asylum, her mind being but too evidently unfit to bear the trial of reverting to them. It was known by the voluntary admission of the owner of the madhouse that she was received there on the 27th of July. From that date until the 15th of October, the day of her rescue, she had been under restraint, her identity with Anne Catherick systematically asserted, and her sanity, from first to last, practically denied. Faculties less delicately balanced, constitutions less tenderly organized, must have suffered under such an ordeal as this. No man could have gone through it and come out of it unchanged. Arriving at Limmeridge late on the evening of the 15th, Miss Holcombe wisely resolved not to attempt the assertion of Lady Glyde's identity until the next day. The first thing in the morning she went to Mr. Fairlie's room, and using all possible cautions and preparations beforehand, at last told him in so many words what had happened. As soon as his first astonishment and alarm had subsided, he angrily declared that Miss Holcombe had allowed herself to be duped by Anne Catherick. He referred her to Count Fosco's letter, and to what she had herself told him of the personal resemblance between Anne and his deceased niece, and he positively declined to admit to his presence, even for 1 minute only, a mad woman whom it was an insult and an outrage to have brought into his house at all. Miss Holcombe left the room, waited till the first heat of her indignation had passed away, decided on reflection that Mr. Fairlie should see his niece in the interests of common humanity before he closed his doors on her as a stranger, and thereupon, without a word of previous warning, took Lady Glyde with her to his room. The servant was posted at the door to prevent their entrance, but Miss Holcombe insisted on passing him, and made her way into Mr. Fairlie's presence, leading her sister by the hand. The scene that followed, though it only lasted for a few minutes, was too painful to be described. Miss Holcombe herself shrank from referring to it. Let it be enough to say that Mr. Fairlie declared, in the most positive terms, that he did not recognize the woman who had been brought into his room, that he saw nothing in her face and manner to make him doubt for a moment that his niece lay buried in Limmeridge churchyard, and that he would call on the law to protect him if before the day was over she was not removed from the house. Taking the very worst view of Mr. Fairlie's selfishness, indolence, and habitual want of feeling, it was manifestly impossible to suppose that he was capable of such infamy as secretly recognizing and openly disowning his brother's child. Miss Holcombe humanely and sensibly allowed all due force to the influence of prejudice and alarm in preventing him from fairly exercising his perceptions, and accounted for what had happened in that way. But when she next put the servants to the test— one moment. Sorry about that. Miss Holcombe humanely and sensibly allowed all due force to the influence of prejudice and alarm in preventing him from fairly exercising his perceptions, and accounted for what had happened in that way. But when she next put the servants to the test, and found that they too were, in every case, uncertain, to say the least of it, whether the lady presented to them was their young mistress or Anne Catherick, of whose resemblance to her they had all heard, the sad conclusion was inevitable that the change produced in Lady Glyde's face and manner by her imprisonment in the asylum was far more serious than Miss Holcombe had at first supposed. The vile deception which had asserted her death defied exposure even in the house where she was born and among the people with whom she had lived. In a less critical situation, the effort need not have been given up as hopeless as yet. For example, the maid, Fanny, who happened to be then absent from Limmeridge, was expected back in 2 days, and there would be a chance of gaining her recognition to start with, seeing that she had been in much more constant communication with her mistress, and had been much more heartily attached to her than the other servants. Again, Lady Glyde might have been privately kept in the house or in the village to wait until her health was a little recovered and her mind was a little steadied again. When her memory could be once more trusted to serve her, she would naturally refer to persons and events in the past with a certainty and a familiarity which no impostor could simulate, and so the fact of her identity, which her own appearance had failed to establish, might subsequently be proved, with time to help her, by the surer test of her own words. But the circumstances under which she had regained her freedom rendered all recourse to such means as these simply impracticable. The pursuit from the asylum, diverted to Hampshire for the time only, would infallibly next take the direction of Cumberland. The persons appointed to seek the fugitive might arrive at Limmeridge House at a few hours' notice, and in Mr. Fairley's present temper of mind they might count on the immediate exertion of his local influence and authority to assist them. The commonest consideration for Lady Glyde's safety forced on Miss Holcombe the necessity of resigning the struggle to do her justice and of removing her at once from the place of all others that was now most dangerous to her, the neighbourhood of her own home. An immediate return to London was the first and wisest measure of security which suggested itself. In the great city, all traces of them might be most speedily and most surely effaced. There were no preparations to make, no farewell words of kindness to exchange with anyone. On the afternoon of that memorable day of the 16th, Miss Holcombe roused her sister to a last exertion of courage, and without a living soul to wish them well at parting, the two took their way into the world alone, and turned their backs forever on Limmeridge House. They had passed the hill above the churchyard, when Lady Glyde insisted on turning back to look her last at her mother's grave. Miss Holcombe tried to shake her resolution, but in this one instance tried in vain. She was immovable. Her dim eyes lit with a sudden fire, and flashed through the veil that hung over them. Her wasted fingers strengthened moment by moment round the friendly arm by which they had held so listlessly till this time. I believe in my soul that the hand of God was pointing their way back to them, and that the most innocent and the most afflicted of his creatures was chosen in that dread moment to see it. They retraced their steps to the burial ground, and by that act sealed the future of our 3 lives. Thank you all for joining me. More tomorrow, and then nothing on Monday. So till tomorrow, I hope you all stay very, very well.